My sister's text arrived at 6:47 a.m., and I read it 3 times before my coffee even finished brewing. Your son won't fit in at SeaWorld, Emily. Our kids planned this for months. Yours just doesn't belong. My son delivers newspapers at dawn, saves every cent. I stared at those words until they blurred, sitting in my Pacific Heights kitchen with its marble countertops and bay windows overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, and something inside me went perfectly, dangerously still. My sister Caroline had always been like this. Growing up in our parents' modest Sacramento home, she'd been the responsible one, the one who clipped coupons and made her own Halloween costumes, while I'd somehow landed the modeling contract at 16 that changed everything. She'd gone to community college, while I'd married Richard Hartwell III, whose family owned half the commercial real estate in San Francisco. She'd married Tom, a middle manager at an insurance company in Daly City, and they'd scraped together a down payment on a 3-bedroom ranch house that she mentioned in every single conversation we had. Her son Bradley was 11, same as my Jake, and apparently Bradley's newspaper route and piggy bank savings made him more deserving of a family vacation than my kid. I texted back just 2 words: I get it. Then I called my assistant, Monica, and told her to book the ultimate VIP experience at SeaWorld San Diego for the same weekend Caroline had planned their trip. $25,000 for a private behind-the-scenes tour, personal marine biologist guide, front-row reserved seating at every show, and a catered lunch with the park director. I also told her to book the presidential suite at the Del Coronado for 3 nights and to arrange a private helicopter transfer from San Francisco. Jake didn't even particularly like marine animals, but that wasn't the point anymore. Richard thought I was being petty when I told him at breakfast. He sat across from me in his custom Tom Ford suit, reading the Wall Street Journal on his iPad, barely looking up. Caroline's always been jealous of you, Em. Why give her the satisfaction of knowing she got under your skin? He had this way of making everything sound so reasonable, so rational, like emotions were just market fluctuations that would correct themselves if you waited long enough. It's not about that, I said, though of course it was entirely about that. It's about Jake. She basically said my son doesn't deserve to go on vacation with his cousin because we didn't struggle enough to afford it. Richard finally looked at me, and something in his expression made my stomach tighten. It was pity mixed with amusement, like I was a child throwing a tantrum over a broken toy. You're spending 25 grand to prove a point to your sister who makes maybe 70,000 a year? You don't see how that looks? I didn't answer. I just thought about Caroline's text message, about the implicit message that my life was somehow less valid because I'd married well instead of struggling nobly through community college and clearance racks at Target. Never mind that I'd modeled for 8 years before I met Richard. Never mind that I'd put myself through San Francisco State while booking commercial shoots. Never mind that I now ran a successful interior design consulting firm with clients all over the Bay Area. None of that counted because I'd married into money. Jake came downstairs then, his dark hair still messy from sleep, wearing his Golden State Warriors jersey. At 11, he was starting to look more like Richard every day, that same sharp jawline, those same calculating gray eyes. Mom, Aunt Caroline texted me. She said maybe I could come on their SeaWorld trip if I helped pay for my ticket with my allowance. Is that weird? The coffee in my hand suddenly felt like acid. Caroline had gone around me to text my son directly to make him feel like he needed to prove his worthiness through some performative financial contribution. I kept my voice steady. We're actually planning our own SeaWorld trip, honey. A really special one. You, me, and Dad. How does that sound? His face lit up in a way that made my heart hurt. Really? When? Same weekend Aunt Caroline's going. We'll probably see them there. Richard's newspaper rustled pointedly, but he didn't say anything. Jake ran back upstairs to tell his friend on FaceTime, and I was left alone with my husband's disapproving silence. We'd been married for 13 years, and I'd gotten very good at reading his silences. This one said I was being irrational, emotional, everything he'd been raised by his proper Connecticut family to view as weakness. "You're going to look petty," he finally said. "You know that, right?" I don't care. But I did care, and he knew it, and that was the worst part. The week before the trip, Caroline called me. Not texted, called, which meant she was either genuinely concerned or building up to something. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hey," I said, my voice carefully neutral. I heard you're taking Jake to SeaWorld the same weekend we're going. That's so funny. We can all meet up, make it a real family thing." Her voice had that bright, fake quality she always used when she was pretending everything was fine. "Bradley is so excited to see his cousin. They can hang out at the park together." I felt something cold slide through my chest. She wanted to fold my expensive VIP experience into her budget vacation, make it look like we were all one big happy family, probably post photos on social media of our spontaneous meetup. She'd get to ride my $25,000 coattails and then go home and tell everyone how some people just have to show off. "That's so sweet," I said, matching her artificial brightness. "Jake's really looking forward to it too. We're doing this whole VIP thing, super exclusive, but I'm sure we'll see you around the park." The pause on her end was delicious. "VIP thing?" "Yeah, private tours, reserved seating, meet and greets with the trainers. Nothing major. Richard just thought it would be fun to spoil Jake a little." I was lying. Richard thought the whole thing was ridiculous, but Caroline didn't need to know that. "Wow," her voice had gone flat. That's really something, Em. Must be nice." "It is nice," I agreed pleasantly. "Being able to give Jake these experiences, I mean. But you guys will have fun too. I'm sure Bradley will love it. There's something special about saving up for something, right? Makes it more meaningful." I was being cruel, and I knew it, and I didn't care. I could practically hear her jaw clenching through the phone. "Yeah," she said finally. "Well, we should let the boys play together at least, before your VIP stuff starts." "Absolutely. We'll text when we get there." I hung up before she could respond and immediately felt both triumphant and slightly sick. Richard was right. I was being petty. But Caroline had drawn first blood with that text message, with the implication that my son was somehow less deserving than hers. The helicopter ride to San Diego was everything I'd imagined. Jake pressed his face against the window the entire time, watching the California coastline unfold beneath us. Richard sat next to me, working on his laptop, occasionally glancing out with mild interest. He'd grown up with helicopter rides and VIP experiences, with the kind of wealth that rendered these things ordinary. Sometimes I wondered if anything truly excited him anymore, or if privilege had sanded down all his edges until he was just smoothly, blandly content with everything. We landed at a private helipad near the Del Coronado, where a driver waited to take us to the hotel. The presidential suite had an ocean view that made Jake gasp, with 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and a balcony that stretched the length of the suite. I took a photo of the view and sent it to Caroline with the caption, "Just checked in, can't wait for tomorrow." I didn't mention where we were staying, but I knew she'd figure it out. The Del Coronado was legendary, and their family was definitely staying at a Hampton Inn or Holiday Inn Express somewhere in Mission Valley. That night, at dinner, at the hotel's upscale restaurant where Jake ordered a $40 steak without blinking, Richard finally brought up what had been bothering him all week. "This thing with your sister is getting out of hand, Emily. You're using our son to make a point." "She used him first," I said, keeping my voice low so Jake, who was texting Bradley about meeting up tomorrow, wouldn't hear. She texted him directly, Rich. She made him feel like he needed to pay his own way with his allowance money. What was I supposed to do? Rise above it, he said, like it was so simple, like emotional ammunition wasn't still ammunition just because it came wrapped in passive-aggressive texts. You're 42 years old, Emily. Your sister makes 70 grand a year and supports a family of 3. You're spending more on this weekend than she makes in 4 months. Don't you see how this makes you look? I see how it makes her look, like someone who's so bitter about her own choices that she takes it out on an 11-year-old kid. Richard sighed, that particular sigh that meant he was done arguing because I was being unreasonable and emotional, and there was no point in continuing. He turned his attention back to his own steak, cutting it into precise geometric pieces, and I felt the familiar loneliness of being married to someone who saw every human interaction as a cost-benefit analysis. The next morning, we arrived at SeaWorld before it opened. Our VIP coordinator, a young woman named Bethany with an aggressively cheerful disposition, met us at a private entrance. The Hartwell family, we're so excited to have you today. We've got an incredible experience planned. She handed us lanyards with special badges that Jake immediately put on with obvious pride. First, we're going to start with a behind-the-scenes tour of our rescue and rehabilitation facility. Then we'll meet some of our trainers and ambassadors. And of course, you'll have front-row reserved seating at all the shows. Jake was practically vibrating with excitement, and even Richard seemed mildly engaged. We spent the morning in areas the general public never saw, touching stingrays in their medical pool, watching veterinarians examine a sea lion pup, learning about the park's conservation efforts. Bethany kept up a steady stream of fascinating information, and I found myself actually enjoying it, forgetting for whole minutes at a time why we were really here. Then my phone buzzed. Caroline, we're here, near the front entrance by the flamingos. Bradley really wants to see Jake before we lose each other in the crowds. I showed Richard the text. He looked at me over his sunglasses. You going to meet them? Of course, I said, as if there had never been any question. Come on, Jake, your cousin's here. We found them easily enough. Caroline, Tom, and Bradley standing by the flamingo habitat, looking exactly like what they were, a middle-class family on a carefully budgeted vacation. Bradley wore a San Diego Padres t-shirt that had probably come from Target, and Tom had a fanny pack around his waist with their park map and sunscreen. Caroline had dressed up, probably her nicest casual outfit, but next to my Reformation sundress and Richard's Italian loafers, they looked like they'd wandered in from a different economic reality. Caroline's smile was too wide, too bright. She hugged me, and I caught a whiff of drugstore perfume. You guys look amazing. Is that Reformation? Just something I grabbed. I hugged Bradley, who'd grown taller since I'd last seen him at Thanksgiving. Hey, buddy, ready for some killer whales? It's orca whales, technically, Jake corrected, in that know-it-all voice that 11-year-old boys perfect. Our marine biologist told us this morning during our private tour. I wanted to kick him, but the damage was done. Caroline's smile froze, and Tom's eyebrows went up. Private tour? Tom asked. Yeah, it's part of the VIP experience, Jake continued, oblivious to the tension crackling around him. We got to touch the stingrays in their medical pool and everything. It was so cool. That's really cool, Jake, Caroline said quietly, and something about his voice, resigned, like he was used to coming in second place, made me feel genuinely awful for the first time since this whole thing started. Richard, sensing the awkwardness, stepped in with his characteristic smooth charm. The boys should hang out together for a while. We've got reserved seating at the orca show at 2, but until then, why don't we all walk around together? Caroline's face brightened with obvious relief. That would be great. We were going to head to the shark encounter next. So we walked through SeaWorld together, this strange, blended family united by nothing except blood and breeding and the complicated arithmetic of who had what and why it mattered. The boys ran ahead, and I fell into step with Caroline, while Richard and Tom talked about some basketball game behind us. This close, I could see the careful way my sister had done her makeup, the tiny crack in her phone screen, the discount rack sandals she'd paired with her nice shorts. She'd always been pretty, prettier than me, actually, with our mother's delicate features and natural grace. But somewhere along the way, struggle had etched itself into the corners of her eyes and mouth. "The VIP thing must be incredible," she said, and I couldn't tell if she was being genuine or passive-aggressive. With Caroline, it was often both. "It's really just a way to skip the lines," I said, minimizing it. "You know how he is." "Must be nice to have a husband who insists on $25,000 park experiences." There it was, the edge in her voice, sharp enough to cut. I stopped walking. "Caroline, why did you text me that Jake didn't fit in? What did you think would happen?" She stopped too, and for a second her carefully constructed facade cracked. "Because he doesn't, Em. Bradley saved his own money for this trip. He gets up at 5:30 every morning to deliver papers in the rain. He wanted this so badly, and he worked for it. Jake just gets things. He doesn't know what it's like to want something you can't have." "That's not fair." My voice came out harder than I intended. "Jake didn't ask to be born into money, and you don't get to decide what struggles are legitimate and what aren't." "No, but I get to decide what kind of values I teach my son." Caroline's eyes were bright with tears she wouldn't let fall. "I wanted Bradley to have this one thing that he earned himself, but now your Jake is going to come back and tell him all about his VIP experience and his helicopter ride and his presidential suite, and Bradley's going to feel like his newspaper route and his piggy bank savings don't matter." The truth of it hit me like cold water. I hadn't been fighting with Caroline at all. I'd been fighting with 11-year-old Bradley, crushing his hard-earned accomplishment under the weight of my credit card and my hurt feelings and my need to prove that my life had value, even if I hadn't struggled the way Caroline thought I should have. "I didn't think about it like that," I admitted quietly. Your text really hurt, Caroline. It felt like you were saying Jake didn't deserve to exist in the same space as Bradley because we have money." "I didn't mean it like that." She wiped her eyes quickly. "I meant that I wanted Bradley to feel special, and I was worried that with Jake there, spending money we could never spend, it would just become another reminder of what we don't have." We stood there in the middle of SeaWorld, surrounded by tourists and crying children and the smell of overpriced churros. And I realized that my sister and I had been having two completely different conversations for the past 2 weeks. She'd been trying to protect her son's sense of accomplishment. I'd been trying to defend my life choices against her perceived judgment. And somehow we'd both ended up using our kids as proxies in a war neither of them signed up for. "I'm sorry," I said, "about all of this, about making it into a competition." Caroline nodded, but her expression was complicated, hurt and anger and something else I couldn't quite read. "Yeah, me too." We caught up with the boys at the shark encounter, where Jake was explaining in elaborate detail about the different species, while Bradley listened with an expression I recognized from my own childhood, polite interest masking deep resentment. This was going to be a long day. Richard kept checking his phone, probably dealing with work emails, while Tom asked Bethany increasingly detailed questions about the shark's diet and habits. Our VIP coordinator answered patiently, but I saw her glance at her watch twice. At 1:30, Bethany pulled me aside gently. "Mrs. Hartwell, just wanted to remind you that your reserved seating for the Orca show starts in 30 minutes. We should probably head over so you can get settled and maybe grab lunch from your private catering area first." "Right, of course. I looked at Caroline, who'd clearly overheard. Her face was carefully blank, but I saw Tom's hand reach for hers, saw the small squeeze he gave her fingers. They'd probably budgeted for exactly one overpriced theme park meal today, and here I was being reminded about my private catering. "You guys should go," Caroline said quickly, her voice bright and hollow. "We're gonna grab some food and then catch the sea lion show. Maybe we'll see you later?" "Actually," I heard myself say, surprising myself, "why don't you all join us? I'm sure we can fit a few more people." I looked at Bethany, who blinked in surprise. "Right? There's enough food?" Bethany recovered smoothly. "Of course, the more the merrier. Your package includes catering for up to 8 people, so you're well within limits." Caroline's expression went through several rapid changes: surprise, suspicion, reluctant gratitude, and then something else I couldn't quite read. "Yeah, me too." Tom and Caroline exchanged one of those married couple looks that conveys an entire conversation, and then Tom nodded. "That would be really nice, actually. Thank you." The VIP seating area was everything the $25,000 price tag promised. Front row center, cushioned seats, our own canopied section separated from the general admission masses. The catered lunch was laid out on a nearby table: sandwiches, salads, fruit, desserts, sparkling water in glass bottles. It was objectively ridiculous, especially watching Caroline try to pretend this was normal, tried to keep her face neutral as Bradley's eyes went wide at the spread of food. We ate lunch while the stadium filled up around us, thousands of regular ticket holders climbing to their seats in the blazing sun, while we sat in cushioned shade with our catered meal. Richard made conversation with Tom about real estate values in the Bay Area, probably without realizing he was casually discussing numbers that represented more than Tom's annual salary. Caroline picked at her sandwich and avoided my eyes. The orca show was spectacular. I had to admit that, even through the lens of my own discomfort. The trainers were talented, the whales were magnificent, and Jake and Bradley both watched with rapt attention, temporarily united in wonder. But I couldn't stop thinking about what Caroline had said earlier, about Bradley's newspaper route and his piggy bank savings, about teaching him values in a world that didn't always reward hard work the way it should. After the show, as we were gathering our things, Bradley turned to Jake with painful earnestness. "That was so cool. Thanks for inviting us to sit with you." Jake shrugged, already moving on to whatever came next. "Yeah, no problem. The VIP seats are way better than the regular ones. You could barely even see from where you guys were sitting before." I saw Bradley's face fall, saw Caroline's jaw tighten, and knew that whatever fragile peace we'd achieved during lunch had just shattered. Tom put his hand on Bradley's shoulder and said something quiet to him, and then Caroline was gathering their things with quick, jerky movements. "We should get going," she announced, to no one in particular. "We wanted to catch the dolphin show at 4, and we need to get over there early for decent seats." "You could come with us," I offered, though I knew what her answer would be. "We have reserved seating there too." "No," Caroline's voice was sharp. "Thank you for lunch, but we're good. We'll see our own way around. That's kind of the point of this trip anyway, Bradley and us doing it ourselves." She walked away before I could respond, Tom and Bradley trailing behind her. Bradley looked back once, and the expression on his face, confused hurt like he couldn't quite understand what he'd done wrong, made my chest ache. Jake, oblivious, was already asking Bethany about the dolphin show and whether we could meet the trainers afterward. Richard waited until they were out of earshot. "That went well." "Shut up." I didn't have the energy to match his sarcasm. I was trying to do something nice. "You were trying to make yourself feel better about doing something mean." He said it matter-of-factly, like he said everything, like emotions were just data points to be analyzed.
Caroline didn't want your VIP experience, Em. She wanted you to acknowledge that her way of doing things, her values, her approach to parenting, has merit too. But instead, you proved her point by showing her that money can buy literally anything, including better views of performing orcas. I hated him in that moment, hated him for being right, hated him for his calm rationality, hated him for growing up so wealthy that he'd never had to examine what money meant or what it cost.
Then what should I have done? Let her text me that my son doesn't belong and just take it? Maybe. Richard put on his sunglasses, blocking his eyes from view. Or maybe you should have asked yourself why her text bothered you so much in the first place. We spent the rest of the day completing our VIP experience, meeting dolphin trainers, getting a behind-the-scenes look at the penguin habitat, having a private dinner with the park director who told us about conservation efforts I forgot before he'd finished speaking. Jake had the time of his life. Richard answered emails between attractions, and I kept seeing Bradley's face, that confusion and hurt. Kept hearing Caroline's voice saying that Jake didn't know what it was like to want something he couldn't have. That night, back in our presidential suite, after Jake had gone to bed exhausted and happy, I sat on the balcony overlooking the dark ocean and tried to figure out why I felt so hollowed out, so disappointed with myself. I'd won. I'd spent more money than Caroline made in months. I'd shown her that her judgment of my life didn't matter. I'd given Jake an experience he'd remember forever. So why did I feel like I'd lost something important? Richard came out onto the balcony with 2 glasses of wine, sitting down beside me without speaking. We drank in silence for a while, listening to the waves crash against the shore below. Finally, he said, "You know what the worst part of growing up rich was?" "Tell me." I was genuinely curious. Richard rarely talked about his childhood, about the Connecticut estate and the boarding schools and the trust funds. Never knowing if anything I accomplished actually meant anything. He swirled his wine, watching the liquid catch the light. Every achievement came with this footnote, but you had every advantage, so does it really count? I got into Yale, but my great-grandfather's name is on a building there. I started my investment firm, but I started it with a loan from my father that most people could never access. Even marrying you, he glanced at me. People assumed it was because you were beautiful and young, not because I actually loved you. Did you? The question came out before I could stop it. Actually love me? He looked at me for a long moment. I thought I did. Now I'm not sure either of us knows what love looks like when it's not performing for someone else's judgment. The words hung between us like smoke, and I realized we were having a completely different conversation than the one I'd thought we were having. This wasn't about Caroline and SeaWorld and competing visions of childhood values. This was about Richard and me, about a marriage that had calcified into something cold and transactional, about 2 people who'd spent 13 years living parallel lives without ever really touching. "Richard," I started, but my phone buzzed with a text message, "Caroline." I opened it, my heart suddenly hammering, and read, "Bradley's asking why Jake didn't want to hang out with him more. Don't really know what to tell him. I know you meant well with lunch, but it just made everything harder. Maybe we should keep some distance for a while." I showed the text to Richard. He read it and handed my phone back without comment. I waited for him to say something cutting about how I'd brought this on myself, about how I'd spent $25,000 to destroy my relationship with my sister, about how privilege and pettiness made terrible partners. Instead, he said, "You can't buy your way out of feeling inadequate, Emily. Believe me, I've been trying my whole life." And then he went inside, leaving me alone with the ocean and the expensive wine and the hollow ache of winning a game nobody should have been playing in the first place. Below, hotel guests laughed and splashed in the illuminated pool. Somewhere in Mission Valley, Caroline was probably tucking Bradley into bed in their budget hotel, having the exact conversation I'd been trying to avoid, that some people have money and some people don't, and neither one makes you better or worse, but both make everything complicated. I thought about texting her back, but what would I say? Sorry I proved all your worst fears about me true? Sorry I used my son to validate my life choices? Sorry I let you make me feel so small that I needed to spend $25,000 to feel big again? The next morning, we took the helicopter back to San Francisco. Jake talked the entire way about the orca show and meeting the trainers and the private penguin tour. Richard worked on his laptop, and I looked down at the California coastline and thought about my sister's text, about keeping distance, about the slow way families fracture, not through dramatic explosions, but through accumulated small cruelties, through competitions nobody remembers starting, through the exhausting work of comparing one life against another until both come up lacking. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't possibly have known as we flew north over the Pacific, was that Caroline's request for distance was the least of what I was about to lose. That Richard's comment about not being sure we knew what love looked like was less observation and more confession. That the real cost of my $25,000 revenge was being tallied in spreadsheets and lawyers' offices and quiet conversations I wasn't part of. That sometimes when you win, you lose everything that actually mattered, and you don't realize it until the bill comes due. The first sign came 3 days after we got back from San Diego, though I didn't recognize it as a sign at the time. Richard started working late more frequently than usual, which for him meant coming home at 9 instead of 7. He'd always been ambitious, always chasing the next deal, the next client, the next proof that his success was his own and not just his last name's. But something had shifted. He was distracted in a way that felt different, not the usual work stress, but something deeper, something he was working very hard to hide. The second sign was the credit card statement. I handled most of our household finances, paid the bills, managed Jake's school expenses and activities, covered my business costs. Richard dealt with the investments, the properties, the larger financial picture. But I still saw the monthly statements, and in early June, I noticed charges I didn't recognize. Dinners at restaurants we'd never been to together, a hotel room at the Ritz-Carlton in Half Moon Bay on a Thursday when he'd told me he was in Los Angeles for a client meeting, flowers from a boutique florist in the Marina District that definitely hadn't been delivered to our house. I sat at my kitchen counter staring at those charges, my heart doing something strange and arrhythmic in my chest. There were explanations, of course. Client dinners, a changed meeting location, flowers for his mother or his secretary. But something about the pattern of it, about the way he'd been looking through me instead of at me lately, made my hands shake as I reached for my phone. I called Monica, my assistant, because she'd worked for me for 7 years and knew everything about my life, including things I wished I didn't know myself. I need you to do something for me, I said without preamble, and I need you to be completely honest with me about what you find. Okay. Monica's voice was carefully neutral, which told me she already suspected what I was about to ask. What do you need? Richard's been acting strange. I found some weird charges on our credit card. I need to know if he's... I couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't make the words real by speaking them out loud. I'll look into it, Monica said quietly. Give me a few days. Those few days felt like decades. I went through the motions of my regular life. Consulting, meetings with clients, Jake's baseball games, dinner parties with Richard's colleagues, while the ground beneath me felt increasingly unstable. Richard and I had never had a passionate marriage, not the kind that burns hot and bright and consumes everything around it. We'd had respect, compatibility, shared goals. We'd had good taste in architecture and wine. We'd had Jake, who bound us together with the unbreakable arithmetic of shared parenthood. But love? The kind Caroline and Tom seemed to have? despite their financial struggles, despite the tiny house in Daly City and the careful budgeting and the newspaper routes. I wasn't sure we'd ever had that, and I'd told myself it didn't matter. Now, I wondered if the absence of that kind of love was exactly what made betrayal possible. Monica called me on a Thursday afternoon. I was at a client site in Nob Hill, consulting on a brownstone renovation when my phone buzzed. "Can you talk?" she asked, and the seriousness in her voice made me excuse myself to the hallway. "Tell me." My voice sounded strange, like it belonged to someone else. "He's having an affair." Monica didn't soften it, which I appreciated. Her name is Vanessa Chen. She's 31, works in venture capital, lives in the marina. They've been seeing each other for about 4 months, from what I can tell. The Half Moon Bay Hotel, the dinners, the flowers, all for her. I leaned against the brownstone's original wood paneling and tried to remember how to breathe. 4 months. He'd been cheating on me for 4 months, which meant he'd been sleeping with someone else when we took Jake to SeaWorld, when he'd sat next to me in that helicopter and lectured me about being petty, when he'd told me we didn't know what love looked like. The sharp, nauseating irony of it made me laugh, though the sound came out broken. "Em?" Monica's voice was concerned. "Are you okay? Did you find anything else?" I heard myself asking, clinical and distant, like this was just another business problem to solve. "Yeah," Monica hesitated. "He's been looking at apartments in Russian Hill, 2-bedroom condos, view properties, all in his name only. And there's something else. I pulled some records, totally illegal, don't ask me how, but he's been moving money. Transferring funds from your joint accounts into private accounts I don't think you have access to. Not huge amounts at once, but steady. About $50,000 a month for the last 6 months. $300,000. He'd been systematically hiding money from me, preparing for something. And I'd been so focused on my sister's text message and my bruised ego and my need to prove that my life had value that I hadn't noticed my marriage falling apart. "Thank you," I managed. "I'll handle it from here." Wait." Monica's voice was urgent. "You need a lawyer, like yesterday. If he's been moving money and looking at apartments, he's planning to leave. You need to protect yourself." She was right, and I knew it, but the practical logistics of divorce felt impossible to process when I couldn't even figure out how to keep standing upright. I thanked her again and hung up, then stood in that brownstone hallway for a long time, trying to understand how I'd gotten here. Was this karma for the SeaWorld thing? Cosmic justice for spending $25,000 to humiliate my sister? Or was this just the inevitable conclusion of a marriage based on compatible taste rather than actual intimacy? I drove home in a daze, running red lights and missing turns, my mind replaying every interaction with Richard over the past few months. How had I missed this? Had I been so consumed by my own hurt feelings about Caroline's judgment that I'd failed to notice my husband falling in love with someone else? Or had I always known, on some level, that Richard and I were playing at marriage rather than living it, and I'd just chosen not to look directly at that truth? When I got home, Richard's car was already in the driveway. He was in his study, jacket off, tie loosened, typing on his laptop with the focused intensity he brought to everything. I stood in the doorway watching him, this man I'd been married to for 13 years, and tried to find any trace of the person I'd thought I knew. "We need to talk," I said, and he looked up with an expression that confirmed everything. Not surprise, not confusion, just resignation, like he'd been waiting for this moment. "Okay." He closed his laptop carefully, methodically, buying time. "About what?" About Vanessa Chen, about the apartment in Russian Hill, about the $300,000 you've been hiding from me. I said it calmly, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Should I continue, or is that enough? Richard's face went through a series of micro-expressions: shock, guilt, anger, and then something that looked almost like relief. How did you find out? Does it matter? I walked into his study, closing the door behind me, even though Jake wouldn't be home from baseball practice for another hour. How long were you planning to keep lying? I wasn't lying, exactly. I was trying to figure things out, and I didn't want to upset you unnecessarily. Upset me unnecessarily? I laughed, and it sounded slightly unhinged. That's very considerate. So, sleeping with a 31-year-old venture capitalist for 4 months, that's just figuring things out? Moving hundreds of thousands of dollars, that's just protecting me from unnecessary upset. Out? Moving hundreds of thousands of dollars, that's just protecting me from unnecessary upset? Don't do that! Richard stood up, and I saw real anger flash across his face. Don't pretend this marriage has been working, Emily. We've been going through the motions for years. You know it as well as I do. The truth of it hit harder than the affair. So that's it? You decided our marriage was broken, so you just went out and found someone else, without even telling me we were in trouble? I tried to tell you. His voice rose, frustration bleeding through his usual careful control. That night on the balcony in San Diego, I was trying to tell you that something was wrong, that we were wrong. But you were so focused on your sister and your hurt feelings that you didn't hear me. Because my husband was supposed to support me. My own voice was climbing now, years of suppressed resentment suddenly finding volume. Instead, you sat there judging me for being petty while you were already cheating on me? When did it start, Richard? Before or after I booked that SeaWorld trip? Before. He at least had the decency to look ashamed. I met Vanessa in February. We started sleeping together in March. March. Right around when Caroline had texted me about Jake not fitting in, when I'd been spinning out with hurt and anger and the desperate need to prove my worth. My husband had been falling in love with someone else, and I'd been too busy planning my $25,000 revenge to notice. Do you love her? The question hung in the air between us, and I saw Richard wrestle with whether to lie, whether to spare me this final humiliation. He chose honesty. I think so. Yes, she makes me feel like... He stopped, searching for words. She makes me feel like I matter as a person, not just as a bank account or a last name. When I'm with her, I'm not Richard Hartwell III, trust fund baby and society husband. I'm just Richard, and that's enough. The irony was so sharp it could draw blood. I'd spent 13 years trying to prove to my sister and to the world that marrying Richard hadn't been about his money, that I'd loved him for himself. And the whole time, Richard had been desperate for someone who didn't see his money at all. We'd both been performing versions of ourselves, trying to escape judgments neither of us knew how to shake, and somehow we'd never noticed we were in the wrong play entirely. What happens now? I asked, too tired to be angry anymore. I want a divorce. He said it gently, but there was finality in his voice. I've already spoken to my lawyer. I'm not going to leave you with nothing, Emily. You'll be taken care of, and Jake will be taken care of. But I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend we're happy when we're just comfortable. Comfortable. That word felt like a slap. Was that really all we'd been? Comfortable? I thought about what Richard had said that night in San Diego, about never knowing if his accomplishments meant anything. I thought about Caroline's text, about Jake not fitting in, about Bradley's newspaper route and his piggy bank savings. I thought about how I spent $25,000 to prove something that nobody actually cared about except me. And then, with awful clarity, I realized what I had to do, what I should have done months ago, instead of booking helicopters and VIP experiences and running from my sister's judgment straight into the arms of my own pride. "I need some time," I told Richard, "to process this, to figure out what to tell Jake." He nodded, relief obvious on his face. "Take whatever time you need. I'm going to stay at the apartment in Russian Hill while we work things out. I'll see Jake whenever you want, as much as you want. We can co-parent civilly, Emily. We're both adults." After he left, throwing some clothes in a bag and driving away from our Pacific Heights mansion like it meant nothing, like 13 years could be packed up and stored that easily, I sat alone in the gathering darkness and let myself cry for the first time since this started. I cried for my marriage, for Jake's intact family, for the version of myself I'd thought I was. I cried because Richard was right, because we hadn't been happy, because comfortable wasn't the same as fulfilled, and I'd spent 13 years not letting myself admit that. But mostly I cried because I'd been so focused on defending my choices to Caroline that I'd lost sight of whether those choices were actually making me happy. I'd spent $25,000 and destroyed my relationship with my sister to prove that my wealthy life had meaning, and the entire time the person who most doubted that meaning was me. The next morning I called Caroline. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice wary. "Em? Can we talk?" I asked. "In person. I'll come to you." There was a long pause. "Is everything okay?" "No," I admitted. "Nothing's okay, but I need to see you." She gave me her address, and I drove down to Daly City in my Range Rover, pulling up in front of the modest 3-bedroom ranch house with its neat lawn and flower boxes. Caroline met me at the door, still in her bathrobe, concern all over her face. "Em, what's wrong? You look terrible." I stood on her doorstep, this house that she'd mentioned in every conversation, that represented her hard-won piece of the American dream, and I started crying again. "Richard's leaving me. He's been having an affair. And I need to tell you something. About SeaWorld. About everything." She pulled me inside without a word, sat me down on her discount store couch, and made me tea while I told her everything. About Richard's affair, about the hidden money, about how I'd spent $25,000 to prove something to her while my marriage was collapsing and I hadn't even noticed. About how scared I was, how angry, how completely lost. Caroline listened without interrupting, her face going through a complicated series of expressions. When she finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry about Richard. That's awful, and he's an idiot. But Em, I need to tell you something too." I looked up at her through my tears. "What?" "I was jealous of you." She said it simply, matter-of-factly, like it was just a truth she'd been carrying around. "I've always been jealous of you. You were the pretty one, the one who got the modeling contract, the one who married into money and got to live in that gorgeous house and never worry about mortgage payments or whether we could afford Bradley's baseball camp. And the entire time, the person who most doubted that meaning was me. Your life isn't less." My voice came out fierce. "Caroline, you and Tom have something real. You have a marriage where you actually love each other, where you're partners. You raised a kid who knows the value of working for something. You built a life that means something, not just looks like something." "And you think you didn't." Caroline reached for my hand. Em, you built a business. You put yourself through college while modeling. You've been a good mom to Jake, even if you spoil him sometimes. Richard cheating on you doesn't erase all that. It just means he was too stupid to see what he had. We sat there together on her couch, holding hands like we used to when we were kids sharing a room in our parents' small Sacramento house, before money and jealousy and competitive parenting had made everything complicated. And I realized that what I'd been looking for, validation, meaning, proof that my life had value, had been right here all along, in the sister who knew me before I was Mrs. Richard Hartwell III, who remembered when I was just Emily Morrison trying to figure out who she wanted to be. "I'm sorry about SeaWorld," I said. "About all of it. About using Jake to prove something to you. About being petty and vindictive and showing off." "I'm sorry too," Caroline said. "About the text. About making Bradley feel like his accomplishment was more legitimate than Jake's experiences. About making everything into a competition." We talked for hours about our childhood and our parents and the different paths our lives had taken, about how we'd both been so focused on defending our choices that we'd forgotten to question whether those choices were actually making us happy, about how money solved some problems and created others, how struggle built character but also wore you down, how there were no easy answers to anything. Finally, as I was getting ready to leave, Caroline asked, "What are you going to do now?" I thought about it, about the divorce that was coming, about the settlement Richard would offer to assuage his guilt, about the life I'd built that was about to collapse and reshape into something I couldn't yet imagine. "I think," I said slowly, "I'm going to figure out who I actually am, not who I thought I needed to be. And I'm going to make sure Jake knows that his worth isn't measured in VIP experiences or how much money his dad has. It's measured in whether he's kind, whether he works hard at things that matter, whether he builds relationships that are real." Caroline hugged me hard. "Call me, every day if you need to. We're sisters, Em. We're supposed to be on the same team." Driving home, I felt lighter than I had in months, maybe years. My marriage was ending, my finances were about to get complicated, and I had no idea what the next chapter of my life would look like. But I had my sister back, and I had clarity about what actually mattered, and that felt like a better foundation than any Pacific Heights mansion, or helicopter ride, or $25,000 theme park experience. When I got home, Jake was there, waiting with questions I didn't have easy answers for. I sat him down and told him that his dad and I were getting divorced, that sometimes adults made mistakes or grew apart, that he was loved by both of us, and this wasn't his fault. He cried because he was 11 and his world was breaking, and I held him and cried too, and promised that we'd figure it out together. The divorce took 6 months to finalize. Richard was generous with the settlement, guilty generous, buying his way out of feeling like a bad guy. I got the house, a substantial monthly support payment, and Jake's college fund secured. Richard got his apartment in Russian Hill, his relationship with Vanessa, and the freedom he'd been looking for. We actually did manage to co-parent civilly, because we'd always been better at being partners in logistics than partners in life. But the real work happened slowly, in small gestures and rebuilt trust. I had lunch with Caroline every week, sometimes at expensive San Francisco restaurants I paid for, sometimes at cheap taquerias in Daly City where she picked up the check. Bradley and Jake started hanging out more, finding common ground in their shared love of baseball and video games, learning to navigate the strange wealth disparity between their families with the oblivious grace of children. Tom and I developed an unexpected friendship, bonding over our shared experience of feeling like outsiders in the worlds our spouses came from. I scaled back my interior design business, taking on fewer clients but doing more meaningful work. I started volunteering at a nonprofit that helped women leaving domestic violence situations furnish their new apartments, using my design skills for something that actually mattered. I went to therapy and unpacked 13 years of performing happiness instead of building it, of trying to prove my worth to people who didn't actually doubt it, except me. And I took Jake camping. Not glamping, not some luxury wilderness experience with heated tents and chef-prepared meals, but actual camping with a tent from REI and hot dogs cooked over a campfire and sleeping bags that smelled faintly of mildew. Jake complained for the first 3 hours, then slowly, grudgingly started to enjoy it. We hiked and skipped stones across a lake and talked about how families changed but love didn't, how money was useful but not meaningful, how the best things in life were usually the simplest. On our last night camping, Jake asked me, "Mom, do you think you and Dad would still be together if we didn't have so much money?" I thought about it honestly. I don't know, honey. Maybe. Or maybe we would have broken up sooner, without all the comfortable padding that made it easy to ignore that we weren't really happy. Money doesn't make relationships work or not work. It just makes the not working part more complicated. "Do you wish we were like Aunt Caroline's family?" he asked. "Like more normal?" "I think every family is normal to themselves," I said carefully, "and every family has their own challenges. Aunt Caroline and Uncle Tom work really hard for everything they have, and that builds character. We have more financial freedom, which gives us different opportunities. Neither is better or worse, they're just different ways of living." Jake was quiet for a minute, watching the fire. Then he said, "I'm glad you and Aunt Caroline are talking again. I missed Bradley." "Me too, buddy." I pulled him close, this kid who'd been used as a weapon in a war he didn't understand, who'd watched his family break apart and was somehow still kind, still resilient. Me too. A year after the divorce was finalized, Richard married Vanessa. I wasn't invited to the wedding, but Caroline came over that weekend with wine and sympathy and the kind of sisterly solidarity I'd been too proud to accept before. We sat on my balcony, the one I'd sat on the night my marriage ended, the one where Richard had told me we didn't know what love looked like, and Caroline asked if I was okay. "Actually," I said, surprising both of us, "I really am. Not happy about the marriage ending, not thrilled that Richard found someone who makes him feel like his money doesn't define him, but okay with where I am. Better than okay, actually."
Good. Caroline raised her wine glass. To okay, to better than okay, to figuring out what actually matters before it's too late. We clinked glasses, and I thought about that text message that had started everything, about my desperate need to prove my life had value, about the $25,000 I'd spent trying to win a competition nobody was actually having except me. I thought about how much I'd lost. My marriage, my sense of security, the comfortable life I'd built, and how much I'd gained. My sister, my self-awareness, my freedom from trying to be someone I'd never actually wanted to be. The moral of the story, if there had to be one, wasn't that money was bad or that struggle was noble. It wasn't that revenge was hollow or that pride came before a fall. It was simpler and harder than that. It was that we spend so much time defending our choices to other people that we forget to question whether those choices are actually making us happy. That sometimes the worst prisons are the ones we build ourselves out of other people's expectations and our own insecurities. That love, real love, the kind that sustains and nourishes and grows, isn't found in VIP experiences or private helicopters or houses in Pacific Heights. It's found in the messy, complicated, sometimes painful work of being honest with yourself and the people you care about.
And sometimes the best revenge isn't proving someone wrong about you, it's proving yourself right about what actually matters. I'd learned that lesson the hard way. $25,000 and one broken marriage and countless hurt feelings later. But I'd learned it, and that, in the end, was worth more than all the VIP experiences in the world. 6 months later, I sold the Pacific Heights house. It was too big, too full of memories of a life I'd outgrown, too much of a statement about who I'd been trying to be instead of who I actually was. I bought a smaller place in the Sunset District, with a view of the ocean and a mortgage I could actually afford on my design consulting income, without Richard's support. Jake got to pick out his room and decorate it himself, learning that sometimes less space means more freedom, that simple can be better than complicated. Caroline came to my housewarming party, along with Tom and Bradley and a dozen other people who'd stood by me through the divorce. We grilled burgers in my tiny backyard and played bocce ball on the grass and laughed about nothing in particular. At one point, I found myself in the kitchen with my sister, washing dishes while everyone else was outside, and she said something that made me stop scrubbing and look at her. "You seem happy, Em. Actually happy. Not comfortable pretending to be happy, but really happy." I thought about it. About my smaller house and my simpler life, and my rebuilt relationships, about Jake, who was learning that work had value, and money had limits, and family was complicated but worth the effort, about Richard, who'd found what he needed, even if it wasn't with me, about myself, who'd finally stopped performing for an audience of critics who mostly existed in my own head. "Yeah," I said, surprised to find it was true. "I actually am." Caroline smiled and bumped her shoulder against mine, and we finished the dishes together in comfortable silence. Outside, I could hear Jake and Bradley laughing about something, could hear the warm buzz of conversation and friendship, and the kind of ordinary happiness that doesn't cost anything except the courage to be honest about who you are and what you need. The SeaWorld VIP experience had cost me $25,000, my marriage, and my relationship with my sister. But in losing all of that, I'd found something infinitely more valuable: myself. Not the version I'd been performing, not the one I thought I needed to be to justify my choices, but the actual me, flawed and learning and trying to do better. And that, as it turned out, was worth every penny I'd spent and every lesson I'd learned. The real VIP experience wasn't about front row seats or private tours or helicopters. It was about being vulnerable enough to admit when you're wrong, brave enough to change course, and wise enough to know that the most important relationships in your life are the ones where you can be completely, messily, imperfectly yourself. And in the end, that didn't cost $25,000. It just cost the willingness to stop running from the truth and start living it instead.